Welcome to our first ever virtual global gathering with Brian Stiller. I'm so excited that we can meet with you from all over the world. Now, I wish we could be doing this in Bangkok physically, and I know you do too. We wish we could have the physical connections, the the chance to sit around and share a meal and really catch up. It's a different quality of relationship when it's physically in person. But I also know you all understand that we're all dealing with various levels of restrictions due to COVID, and so this is the situation we're in right now, and so we have to adapt the best we can. And so because of that, even though we have to delay Bangkok another year, I did not want to delay you getting to hear from Brian Stiller and Melba McGay any longer. They've been waiting 2 years to meet you and share with you, and I know you've been waiting to hear from them. They've got some great stuff they prepared to share with us. They were each preparing 3 talks for Bangkok, and so we've decided to have 3 different sessions with Brian, 3 different dates in the spring and 3 different dates in the fall with Melba, so you can hear what they wanted to share with us. Not only hear from them, I'll introduce Brian in a few minutes, and then he'll share his talk with us, and then we'll have a live Q&A time with him, and then we'll go into breakout rooms where we can discuss it together, process it, chew on it, see how does it apply in our context as IC leaders, and then pray for one another before we go. The whole thing will last no more than an hour and a half. We'll go into breakout rooms at the top of the hour, so if anybody can't stay for the breakout rooms, then there will be that option to leave. Although we do encourage you to stay and be a part of it, as I think it'll be great to meet people and pray with people. And actually today, we have our regional coordinators who are leading those breakout rooms. I don't know if you're aware of our regions yet. I hope you are. But if not, we have 4 regional coordinators who cover the entire globe. And if you have not yet met the regional coordinator for your area, please send an email to admin@micn.org. Let us know who you are, where your church is, and we'll have the appropriate regional coordinator reach out to you. They'd love to get to know you. We want to strengthen you wherever you're at, and that starts with us listening to you and getting to know you and what your needs are so we can be a better network for you. So I'm really excited. The regional coordinator is doing a great amount of work and just doing a fantastic job, and today they're coordinating our breakout rooms. Now, we do have 2 different times today, and we'll have 2 different times each time we do these meetings so that people from Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, Oceania can all find a time that works for them. Our next meeting will be on May 18th, which is a Tuesday, and then on June 8th will be the 3rd one, also a Tuesday, with Brian. And then we have some dates in the fall that we'll tell you about when we're a little bit closer for us to hear from Melba. Now, next year, we do hope May 2nd through the 5th to be in Bangkok. That's May 2nd through the 5th, 2022. At the Evangelical Church of Bangkok. We have a fantastic speaker. His name is Bekele Shenko. He is the chairman of the Global Alliance for Church Multiplication. He's Ethiopian and did a fantastic job building an organization there. He now lives in the U.S. He is also a vice president with Youth for Christ, and he also works with Rick Warren on his project Finishing the Task. And so he's a great guy, but he knows a lot about multiplication, and not just in the West, but on the global scale. And so that's our theme for next year's global gathering, multiplication. So we're excited about that. Oz Guinness also wants to be a part of it. He's probably not going to be able to travel in person, but he plans to prepare some videos for us as well, made for us as IC leaders, because he really loves what we're doing, what you're doing, wherever you're at in the world. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce Brian to you and get into his talk. Brian was raised in a minister's home in Canada. He was educated at the University of Toronto for his bachelor's, went on to get his master's at Wycliffe College, and then he went to Gordon Conwell for his doctorate. And then Brian has had a really colorful history. It's fantastic the ways that God has called him to serve. He was the director of Montreal Youth for Christ, and then later the Canadian president of Youth for Christ. And then he went on to lead as the president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada for a number of years, and then he became the president of Tyndale University College and Seminary. And then in 2011, he became the global ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance, where he still serves today. The World Evangelical Alliance, the WEA, serves some 600 million evangelical Christians. And so Brian, as their global ambassador, travels the world, meets with leaders from all different places. He works with people in the UN, with political leaders, church leaders, and he just has a really unique perspective on how the church is growing and having an impact, and a peek into the future of it. And so he's come today to share with us his first talk about the explosive growth of the church, and then his next 2 talks in May and June will be focused more on being a leader in the international church. So I hope that you enjoy this, and we're just so appreciating having Brian with us. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks so much for preparing and spending today with us.
I'm delighted to be with you today. Over a year ago, we were to have met in Thailand. And I was looking forward to that. I like Thailand. I like what you're doing. I've been to many international churches around the world. And I have great respect for you and for your life and what you're doing and the kind of, what you pay to be where you are and to do what you do. And so as Jacob and I had talked about this some time ago, I reflected on what might be of help. And so back and forth, we came up with what I think might be 3 helpful insights as you think about your own life. The first one comes out of a question that I had as I traveled the world starting a decade ago with the World Evangelical Alliance as global ambassador. And being the old white-haired man of the group, my role was to bump around the world and encourage younger leaders. You see, back in '87, I chaired the first Lausanne Younger Leaders Conference in Singapore. And so I've always had an interest in emerging younger leaders and helping them with what they're doing and thinking and becoming. But as I traveled, people would ask me a question: what's going on in the world? And I'll end this message today with a story of one of my first encounters that was a bit of a nudge of the Spirit in my life. Nudges have been important. I want to come back to that as we conclude. Now, this isn't a biblical message. I'll try and do the next 2 out of the biblical text. This is more of an overview coming out of my travels and my insights coming from missiologists, the scholars that do the work, and I've tried to put together an assessment. InterVarsity did a book called From Jerusalem to Timbuktu. The idea of Jerusalem to Timbuktu came out of my discussion with Todd Johnson, who's head of global studies at Gordon Conwell. And he gave me a map one day that showed that the critical center of Christian population, and that's important, the critical center of Christian population, obviously was in Jerusalem. That's where the early church began. And then as the church moved westward through the missionary enterprises and then southward into North Africa, that center of the Christian population moved. And it eventually moved across through Italy and then to Spain. And now, because of the explosion in the global south, the center of the population of Christians, it's a center of the density. So if you could bring the density of all the Christians together and find out where's the center of density, the specialists in this area say that it's in Timbuktu. That's where the density of Christians finds its center. So that's where the idea came from. But at the very core of it is the understanding of the movement of the gospel around the world. Well, people said, what's going on? And I would come back and talk to people in seminaries and churches and donors. And the question that haunted me was, as I looked at the numbers, in 1960, there were 90 million evangelicals. But the year 2020, there were 650 million. So, what question jumps out at you when you look at that? Question is, how did it happen? And that became the pursuit of my own inquiry as I thought and studied and researched and wrote. For example, Latin America, in 1900, there were 50,000 evangelicals, and today there's 100 million. It's estimated that in 49, when the Kuomintang fell and Mao took over in China, there were about 700,000 Christians. And today, how many Christians? The guesses are between 80 and 140 million, somewhere in there. And so you have in Africa, in 1910 at the Edinburgh Conference, which was the first missionary conference, you had in Africa, there were 5.4 million Christians in Africa in 1910. And so at the Edinburgh conference, their conclusion was that by the end of the 20th century, Africa would be Islamic. But today, how many are there in Africa? How many Christians in Africa? From 5.4 to 542 million today. So how did it happen? And that was my inquiry. Here's my assessment. There are three drivers to the growth of the evangelical community, and thus the wider church community. And there are two shapers that have been modeling and influencing our community over the last few decades. Let me take you back to the kind of the macro. We'll go up to 10,000 meters or 30,000 feet. Of the 2.4 billion Christians, there are three major groupings within that community. One side, you've got the Roman Catholic, 1.2 billion, about half. The World Council of Churches, about 500 million. And of those 500 million, 300 million would be Orthodox. And then the evangelical community, 650 million. So you've got those three, the Vatican's 1.2 billion, the World Council, which includes 300 Orthodox, 500 million, and evangelicals over 600 million. There's the macro. How did we go from being just a small part of the larger Christian community to being 1/4 of the Christian community today? When you look at the development of the church over the 20th century, it seems to me that the most powerful movement that has affected the entire church would be a new understanding of the Holy Spirit. There have been various movements, Pentecostal, charismatic, other kind of movements in the 20th century that would pinpoint particular outpourings or outbreaks at various times and among various people. But the broader issue is this. Up until the end of the 19th century, the Holy Spirit was, let me use this metaphor, was overshadowed by the Father and the Son. When you look back at the debates of the early church, they were all about the deity of Christ, his humanity and his deity, the nature of the Trinity. Yes, the Spirit would be mentioned. Spirit was always included, always seen as part of the Trinity, but the understanding of the Spirit as a person, as a gifter, as an empowerer, our theology was pretty modest. Oh, you have occasional outbreakings of interest of the Spirit in various times, Desert Fathers, various people. Martin Luther was fairly explicit. The Wesley brothers were, although the Wesley brothers were nervous about it because they knew what their charismatic experience would mean to their wider influence, and so they kept it pretty well undercover. But I didn't understand how little we knew of him until the 20th century. And it seemed that moment in time, the Spirit broke into our consciousness and, of course, into our theology, created all kinds of misunderstandings and, I think, misappropriations of biblical texts. But let me just say that I was raised in a Pentecostal minister's home, and I'm ordained with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. And so I speak as one who's rooted in that community, but quite aware of the dynamics. But over the 20th century, let me talk about the influence. Of course, initially, there was an enormous chasm that was created within the evangelical community as we now know it. On one side, you have the cessationists who say, no, those gifts of those power gifts of the Spirit ended with the coming of the canon in the 4th century. So it was no longer needed. So you have cessationism. But then you have this breakout, and you have, immediately it happens, you have a missionary enterprise. People go around the world, and there is a missionary enterprise associated with this movement. And so as we move along in the 20th century, the growth of what we know as the evangelical community today, the growth happened with a fair chasm between. Now that chasm, it's interesting how the Spirit does his work in bringing us together. And so it was, of all people, the Lord used Catholics and Anglicans. And Father Bennett, who was in Van Nuys at the time and had a charismatic experience and told his story and was eventually moved by his bishop up to northwestern US. Out of that broke a new understanding of the Spirit. And it was this, because the issue was glossolalia. That was the prime issue, glossolalia in tongues. And out of the charismatic renewal, which came Episcopal, Catholic, around the world, the conclusion was this: cessationism is wrong. The Spirit never ceased his gifting or his empowering. And so the old cessationism notion, they said, simply is a bad rendition of the history of the Spirit in the church. But also, the gifts of the Spirit are for today. But the evidentiary issue, which was so contentious, that glossolalia was an evidence of being filled with the Spirit, they said, that's a gift, it's not an evidence. And so as the church increasingly became aware of the importance of the Spirit, the non-charismatic, the non-Pentecostal, all of a sudden there is a new move towards seeing and understanding the Spirit. But now when you look at it kind of missiologically, on the broad stroke, what happened? What was at the core of it? Well, the Spirit is an empowerer. He gifts us to speak of Christ. The church was very much out of its hierarchical experience through the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. It had found a more of an equilibrium through the Protestant Reformation, but there was still this kind of status of the preacher, of the theologian, of the specialist. But what the Spirit did was remind everyone that each of us are a temple of the Spirit. The Spirit empowers and gifts each of us. Yes, there are people that are called to do special service as pastors within our community and evangelists. But none is specially designed over another. And when this notion that I, as a person, before God, am at the same level, standing on the same dais as a priest or a pastor or evangelist or whomever, the Spirit is in me. He is equipping me. He is empowering me to tell the good works of Jesus. That evangelistic impulse, historically, in my view, changed the church. And you have evangelism of person to person. You have witnessing going on. I was with a professor in Nepal and asked the question, how did it explode here? He said, think about it for a moment. He said, you're up in a village and you have a son who's dying, and it's hours across the valley to any medical clinic, and there's nothing you can do, and you're desperate. And your neighbor comes in and says, well, we believe in prayer. We believe that Jesus will heal. And you as a Hindu, you say, hey, that's fine, whatever works. And so there's anointing and there's a healing. And the next morning, the little boy is running around. And the professor said, can you imagine what would happen in that village? Or when there is a husband who is badly treating everybody, and an evangelist comes into the little village and encounters this person, and in the name of Christ relieves the man of a demonic spirit, and all of a sudden this man is caring for his family and is kind to his neighbors. He said, what other kind of message do you need to tell people about Jesus? So I think one of the most powerful mobilizers of the church, of course, is the Spirit. That's what he came to do. But in the 20th century, particularly, the awareness of him and his work exploded the church. The second thing was the Word. The Word was translated. The 1940s, you have the the real breakout of Bible translation. And as the Wycliffe translators and others got into high gear, all of a sudden you have mobilizing translators to languages and dialects. Now, I've always lived with a Bible in my hand. As a boy, I loved to listen to my mom read the Bible stories. That was the biggest punishment, was having to go to bed while my brothers and sisters listened, and I had to be alone in bed for my naughty deeds. But one day I was preaching in a Chinese church in Toronto, and the first service was in Chinese, Cantonese, or Mandarin. The second one was in English. And I noticed that there were more in the Chinese service than the English service. So I had an English service. I said to Pastor, how many of your people in the first service would speak English? Oh, he said, they all speak English. He said, well, why wouldn't they come to the English service? He said, Brian, there's no echo. Echo, I thought. What does that mean? And as I thought about it, I realized that in your own language, there is a resonance, there's an echo, that when you hear a word, there's a richness of that word out of your memory and out of your life experience that fills out the idea by that word. But if you are working from translation, it's linear. You're moving from one word to so that this word means this in my language and therefore means this here. And by that time, you're into the next word. Whereas when I read the scriptures, or when I hear music, or when I see advertisement in my language, it's a word that is resonating with me. It has echo. And so when a person takes the Bible and reads it or listens to it in their own tongue or in dialect, there is a echo effect. And they then are sitting right in the prison with Paul as he's writing to the Christians in Philippi or Ephesus. He's there with Luke as he is describing the early church. He's listening to Jesus, or she's listening to Jesus as he's standing on the shore side talking to the disciples. It's altogether different. The Bible into the translation into my language makes the difference. You see, Jesus is incarnational, but the Bible is incarnational. It's interesting in the Islamic community, you want to read the Quran, you want to memorize the Quran in its original classic Arabic. You want to read it and study it there. And so if you don't speak Arabic at all, either current or classic, you still memorize it. And I asked, when do you understand what's being said? And he said, not initially. Why? Because the Quran is holy in its original language. For us, we call our Bible holy, but only Jesus is holy. Bible is to be transcribed into the language so that people understand, as Jesus was incarnate in human flesh. I think the parallel can be drawn that the scriptures is also incarnate in human language. The actual words are not sacred in the sense that you've got to go back to the original to appreciate and to hold it sacred. The sacredness is in the word Jesus Christ. He's the Logos. And so we have felt free. In fact, Luke felt free to use the Koine Greek, the most popular Greek at the time, Greek language at the time, or dialect. So people could understand. And when the Bible became available, it simply exploded. But there's a third driver of this growth from 90 million to 650 million just over 6 decades. And that's the indigenization of leadership. Much of the global South was colonized by Europeans. And you have that, all the factors that go with colonization, good and bad and indifferent. But then in the mid-50s, as things began to upend, As a boy, I was fascinated with Kenya and the Mau Mau and the anger against missionaries and all that they represented. I was shocked, of course. I was a boy. I was living in a missionary family, and we loved to hear about missions, and we had missionaries come through. But at that point, the missionary community was forced to change. Some chose willingly to change. We see that maybe more in China than in Africa. But as the younger leaders took over, it's obvious to us in reflection how powerful the effect that would have. But when you have young men primarily, but some women who speak the language, who understand the culture, who know the back roads of the community, can speak into the issues and concerns of their people, it makes all the difference. No longer is it a white man's religion, and no longer is Jesus a white man's God, and neither is he a white God. He now becomes part of my world. He came and lived into my neighborhood, not just the British or the American or the Canadian neighborhood. And because of that, because he now is in my life, in my community, the one who is leading understands best and can help in the mobilizing of churches and evangelism and the teaching and caring in a variety of ways. And so when you look at the indigenization of leadership, it's moved the gospel from simply being an addition of numbers to a multiplying factor. But also it gave the church greater legitimacy within the community. It was seen by its government, it was seen by the civic society as being not a white man's burden, but something of their own community, a gospel that speaks into itself. It's taken some time to create the literature that allows the indigenous nature of ideas and metaphors to work their way into the expression of the gospel community by community. But it has been happening. It's interesting when you look at the Three Self movement in China. It was an idea that was developed back in the 1800s by some Brits. And their question was, it seems to me that we're simply transplanting a British church in China. And so the Three Self movement of self-leadership, mobilizing and self-funding, it became part of the development of the church. And so, as in my reading and my understanding of the scholars, the church in China had a strength that was able to last its way through the Red Guard and all that period, so that in the late 70s and early 80s, as the country changed, they were there ready. The development of the indigenous leadership was critical. But then there are two other factors that have been changing the nature of the church. And the first of this is what I would call the re-engagement in the public square. So the drivers, a new understanding of the Spirit, Bible translation, indigenous leadership. But now there are two molders, shapers that I want to bring forward that I think helps us understand the wider picture. And that's a re-engagement in the public square. Now, out of much of our evangelical history, at least in Canada and in many places, and because of that, in the Western world, the mission enterprise carried this message, is that our real role in evangelism was to get people saved and ready for eternity and living a holy life. And the other issues we were to leave to other people to manage. And historians call this the Great Reversal. And so our engagement in the public square, that's a metaphor that talks about, education, hospital, medical care, government, business, those things that are public, those things that we can access publicly or we can lead publicly. But we chose to basically stay away from managing government. We had many school teachers and many doctors and nurses, but the role was to serve, not to lead. And so many of us in the community that I was raised in, up until the 70s, thought that as we got people ready for eternity, the rest of the world our country would be managed by people who still believe basically in biblical principles, even if they weren't born again. But we quickly found out that was tenuous. It would not hold. Those who were leading increasingly in a secularized environment not only thought the gospel had nothing to say, but thought the gospel had no right to say anything. And that became a very sharp dividing line. We recognize that salt and light means operative presence in the society, in the areas of leadership, be it government, medicine, education, business, media. And that has been the theme for many evangelicals worldwide. In some places, they've overstepped the boundaries. You look at Kenya and Zambia, and it's not been pretty. Other places, South Korea has struggled with the same thing. What is the line between engaging in the public square and being so entrapped and then using that power to do the work of the gospel? And what is the balance? It's a very difficult balance. We've seen this in many countries in South America. But the point is this: when Jesus said, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all they that dwell therein," when the Bible says that, we read that, we know that there is no part of the world that God doesn't say that's my own. That's his. The question then is how we engage in the public square in such a way that we are truly kingdom people with kingdom principles, kingdom motives, and kingdom methods. That's something we are working out, but the church is changing as we re-engage in the public square. But the fifth molder is a new understanding of the power of the whole gospel. The old paradigm had divided between the sacred and the secular. And we tended to separate our workplace from the sacred space. And so church was the place that we did the work of God, and then we went to work Monday morning. But that false line has been removed. And what it has done, and we've seen this emerge naturally over the last few decades, is an engagement in the needs of human justice, caring for people in their own human need, that helping a person live today is kingdom work as much as getting somebody ready for eternity, because time is part of eternity. And when we try to encapsulate time and remove it out of eternity, we're robbing God of that which he's created. He has put us here in his creation to serve all aspects of his world. And as we serve and work today, we are in the process of working towards into eternity his good purposes. Doing his good purposes today allow us to walk into that eternity in line with him. We recognize that the old division of the early part of the 20th century, when the so-called social gospel was defined, and the Protestant liberal wing shifted that way and eventually moved away from discounting the biblical record, Christ as being the Son of God, the need for salvation, and the social gospel defined redemption. Caring for people was the final redemptive act. And we looked at that and we were afraid that lining up with the so-called social gospel was a liberalizing of the faith, and was taking us, and like a gravitational pull, moving us away from what we thought was orthodox and biblical and evangelical. But now we realize that indeed, if God says, "I love justice," we should love justice too. The old social gospel church, it is in a demise of its own making. Its numbers have dropped, of course, and its credibility, in my view, has not stood the test of time. We today, as we are shaped by an understanding of the need to care for holistically all of people, all of a person in their own life, their own body, their own life, their own family, their community, their society. The gospel calls us to care about them. So 3 drivers: the Spirit, Bible, indigenous leadership. Two prime shapers, a new understanding of the public square and in re-engagement, and caring about the holistic gospel. We speak to all things. As I was engaging in this work, I ended up in Mogadishu in Somalia. I should never have ended up there. I was struggling early in my work. I was to be where there were needs. And as the Horn of Africa was erupting with all kinds of hunger and deep tragedy, I just felt if I could go there, I could help. Talked to a major humanitarian agency, and they said, yes, if you'll come, we'll look after you. And it's really important that you be there speaking for evangelicals. And so I went, and then it all fell apart. And in a strange way, I ended up in Mogadishu. And as I did, the authorities said, we can't let you out of here. You're white. They're going to kill you or kidnap you. And so hours later, they found a warlord. He was a nice warlord at the time. And I paid him so much money, and his little army looked after me, and his hotel was guarded. He had an army of 100. So I had a truck with the guards, aide-de-camp, and a driver, and I went around to the various places. It was not wise, but I was there. And it was interesting. We were staying in a hotel, and by the hotel, right next to in the courtyard of the hotel, it was surrounded by walls, and there was the army surrounded it. And it was an afternoon. It was the beginning of Ramadan, and they weren't eating and waiting for the sun to go down, and they were all sitting around. And someone said, "You Canadians are all cowards." And I was kind of surprised. I said, "Why?" Well, he said, "You always go to Nairobi, you never come to Mogadishu. Why have you come?" And so I knew this was an opportunity of just expressing the gospel and speaking to him. And so I had a captured audience. And I talked to them. I spoke to them about faith. We had a great conversation. On the way out, as I was leaving through the airport, there was a young man standing, doing the surveying for weapons or whatever. And he had a T-shirt on in English. And I thought, the kid doesn't speak English. He would never say that. He would never wear this. It said, "This is true," John 3:16. And when I got to him, and I said, "What's John 3:16?" Assuming he didn't understand English. And in the next few seconds, he told me about his faith in Christ. And I thought, how in the world, here in Somalia, in the airport in Mogadishu, talking about faith, how bold is he? I got home, and my brother asked, "What did you accomplish?" And I said, I have no idea. Oh, he said, "Maybe you went there to encourage that young man." And my wife said, maybe, but she said, "I think the Spirit was nudging him and testing him in his early role in his new calling as to whether he would hear the Spirit, feel the Spirit's nudge." That's really what it was about. And it gave me understanding of the Spirit nudging me in life. So as you have listened to me over the last few minutes talk about the various dynamics at work, at least as I understand, and your critique will refine or refute or add, where's the nudge of the Spirit in your life? Lord Jesus, in this moment, we confess we need you. We love you. We want to do your service. We want your kingdom to reign. I pray for my sisters and brothers in their various parts of the world as we are caught in this annoying and damnable pandemic. Lord Jesus, give us wisdom and courage to know what to do and to do it well. May this time be redeemed. May we make good of this moment. And now we thank you through Christ. Amen.
How do you see our role now? And also, how do you see the indigenous, let's say I'm thinking now South American going up to North America or to Europe to go and evangelize and re-evangelize Europe's kind of, how do you see our roles as cross-cultural workers?
Yeah, the pattern of movement is changed, and so the movement of the indigenous leaders in the mid 20th century, of course, has now moved to the place where you have the movement of people around the world, so that in Europe, some of your biggest churches are run by Africans. Here in Toronto, some of the big churches are run by people from Latin America. I suspect that if you are from the Western world and you're living in a non-Western world in the global South, each city or each community will be different in relationship to its reaction to the old colonializers. Some will have gotten over it. Some will still bear resentment. Also, I suspect that if you as a person from the non-global South, living in the global South, have been there long enough, because of the mixture of people. In Toronto, we have, what do we speak, 175 languages. There is such a mixture that the old idea of being white and Western and in a global South, and therefore you're standing out, is not as distinct as it used to be. So I suspect by your personal ability in building relationships and creating access to the civic leadership, that will define your relationship to them and your ability to influence, more than the old cultural trend of it having to be an indigenous leader being the spokesperson.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks so much.
Brian. Yeah, thanks, Werner. You know, I think dovetails really nicely into that. We're going to zoom over to Tanzania now. And David Owens there has a question that I think relates to this well. So, David, if you don't mind asking your question.
Yes, good afternoon.
Hi.
I'm Canadian too, by the way. I think we've got a few Canadians online, so that brings some credibility to this.
Well, we're glad you're taking over the world, if you didn't know.
Mr. Stoward, I'm just looking at it from, well, I've been experiencing right from our early days. We've been out here 14 years. And one of the challenges is the tension of nationalism and the re-indigenization of this particular continent. And so a reverse racism, if you will. And while the global village dynamic is happening in the developed world. So my question is, how do we navigate this with integrity? Because while immigration is happening and we're being embraced, immigrants, and we see it, that this as being really a divine movement in terms of reaching the lost, where the mission field is coming to the West, basically. Now we are actually on the continent here, and it's this tension of walking that fine line, having embraced the fact that we are, of course, guests in whatever country where we haven't been born in or aren't nationals in. But how do we kind of walk that with integrity and with missional authority? I guess I don't know really how to phrase it better.
Oh, yeah, you guys are wrestling with things that I've never had to wrestle with. I'm an interloper on this issue. I suspect, in my experiences with the WEA and in the places I've been to, there generally tends to be high regard. It's a racial thing and might be a racist thing, but it's that those of us from the global north, there still is a respect and a regard which creates space and place for us as influencers. Now, that might come out as as resentment, but I think underlying it there is a regard, and I think you have ingredients that give you leverage, or you have a fulcrum that gives you leverage of influence. And I would think that the influence would be, as I said earlier, a door opener, but also an encourager of the young Indigenous pastor leader. I think yesterday a friend sent an article that done by John Stott. And I got to know John Stott over the years in my work in Lausanne and my work in WEA. And I found, for example, I chaired the first Lausanne Younger Leaders Conference, which was held in Singapore in 1987. And John Stott asked if he could come. Now, I traveled the world. I'd found about 350 younger leaders, brought them together for 2 weeks. And we were just exploring the issue of those are the first generation following post-Second World War church leaders. What are we thinking? What are we doing? And John Stott came to Singapore. He wasn't asked to speak. All he did was sit among us and listened and walked among us and ate with us and was open to talking to people, just as an encourager. And that to me is a model. Is there a way for us to look into the eyes of the younger leaders in the Indigenous leaders in your community, your nationals, and find ways to encourage them, not as a way to enhance your own ministry, but as a goal, as an end objective itself? You do have influence, you have presence, just all the things that I've mentioned. And that's enormous influence, and I would not underrate that, even when you get people who are angry with you because there's resentment and maybe past history. But I would use who you are as a way to build into the younger leaders an encouragement and a strength that gives them confidence, gives them some tools in ministry. The word is mentorship, and that would be, I think, an enormous gift that would break down a lot of the barriers that you might otherwise be erected between you and the nationals.
Before we go on to our breakout groups, we're going to go to Dubai now for a great question that relates all this to our current COVID pandemic. So Bill Kugler, if you would share your question with Brian.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing with us some contributing factors in the past to bring us up to the present. I was just curious if you had any guesses as to what some of the contributing factors moving forward, maybe in the next 5 or 10 years might be. And I realize 5 or 10 years in COVID language is like eternity. So do what you want to with the question.
And for me, Bill, 10 years means I'm 90. So, life has a way of catching us. I feel like I'm 60, but I'm not. I'm fooling myself. Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, for me, the year before COVID, 2019, I had 84 plane flights. So I was in about 15 countries and I was moving about. And of course, now the opposite is true. And I've had to find my intentionality in this lockdown. I've done some churches, both physically and by Zoom, and I've listened to the conversation. A few things come to mind. One is that this is not going to be over as soon as we thought it was. It's going to linger. It's going to find its bumps, and I don't know how long it's going to be before people feel free to come out. The fear factor is going to continue to inhibit people. I think that the deep need for community, for fellowship, is going to override the tendency to stay with the Zoom meeting and not be there physically. But because we have built skills and technologies in this kind of communication, I would think that to use this as an ongoing tool would be appropriate. People are more familiar with it now. The technology is better, and we're just finding different ways to communicate. So I would put this into your arsenal of activity, of finding some ways, and I'm not sure how that works within your own community, but it also, what it might be, because you're part of the international church, it's a way for you to speak, because you are in English, speak to the global north out of your own context, and by so doing, encourage other people to think possibly of doing what you're doing, because the international church is not a passing fad. I believe it's a force that will continue with greater strength, and you're going to need a greater supply of people who will come and do what you're doing and be better oriented when they do come. And so I think this is a way of you building your audience, not just for the sake of your own good preaching, which I'm sure it's terrific, but also building an audience of people who understand the nature of this mission and become, in their comfort, they may feel the nudge of the Spirit for this as well. So I don't think any of us know how this is going to play its way out. I don't think it's going to so much inhibit the numbers of people who want to attend. I think what it may have done, it may decrease the sense of emotional need for people to have spiritual affirmation within a gathered community. That's my sense. People have just gone elsewhere, and they just don't feel the need for spiritual affirmation within that gathered community. But all bets are off.
Thank you. Thank you for the insight. And everybody on the call heard it. That's some good job security, you guys. More and more international churches. Thank you for the insight. Appreciate the answer.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks so much for that, Brian. Let's go and move over, I would say, to Florence. Although, Diane, you're not in Florence right now, but I always think of you as being in Italy. That's where your international church, and you've served for years. I know you've got a question for Brian.
Morning, Brian, at least here. And I really appreciate how you laid out those 5 areas. That is very meaningful. A couple of questions I have. As international church pastors, we deal with people from multiple ethnicities. And you talked about the echo effect. And we may not have the privilege of being able to put our messages, our conversations, all in one, or in the language of the people, just simply because we just don't have it capability-wise.
Right.
You also talked about the indigenous, and I know there's been a lot of concentration on cross-cultural, bringing in the understanding we need to, when we're being missional, we need to understand the culture to who we're ministering. But in international churches, we are also crossing multiple cultures. So, these being factors of growth and thinking about the future and the ability we now have through our international churches to broaden our global impact through multiple channels, will this then become the new factor in our missional approach?
Diane, that is such a critical question and a focus, and of course it's one that I did not reflect in my material because I was looking at the major factors of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Obviously, over the last few years, as symbolized by the international church, there are 2 other factors at play here. One is the mixing of cultures, where you come together, and so at your church in Firenze, you have this place where people of multi-cultures come together and generally speak out of maybe an English voice or whatever language you use, probably a Western language. and they're from different cultures, but they tend to be on a more of a maybe a higher socioeconomic level because of their responsibilities and the work that they're doing. So you have a mixing. Then you have the movement the other way. You have the opposite to the colonial movement. You have, so in Europe, you'll have, in Germany, you'll have one of the biggest churches that will be run by, pastored by someone from Africa. Here in Toronto, we've got a Ghanaian pastor who has a number of churches, not only with West Africans, but people out of Pakistan and India. So you have those that we have gone to are now coming to us. So we have this mixture. I think that the cosmopolitan nature that's generated by global migration, and migration is just, it's such a factor now, and it's going to become increasingly so. I'm not sure, Diane, what that will do. It's creating a different paradigm for many, and for you pastoring in a city where you have people of mixed backgrounds. I guess one of the things that it's important that you don't misunderstand or underutilize, and that's while you are, if you're white, or if you're part of the kind of the global North majority people, even though some people from the global South, because of the colonial and all the things that are going on, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a respect that is accorded to you. And there's an opportunity you have for opening doors, first of all, for people into various sectors of influence, but also to encourage those younger people of maybe of a background or a color that doesn't give them ascendancy, and to encourage them and mentor them in the kind of ways and understanding that will, when they get when doors open to them, they've learned something from you that enables them to walk through that door. So I think that the international church as a movement, I think you're just seeing the beginning of it. I see it as becoming a very large and significant movement as days go forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brian. Well, let's move over to Bremen, Germany. Paul, I know you've got a question. Are you still there, Paul? I see now your video's out.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm just, I apologize. I've got another meeting and I'm having to cook my dinner before that, so I'm multitasking, but really enjoying this. Thank you so much, Brian, for what you've shared. I have a question. I hear a number of voices at the moment saying that if we are to see the full harvest that we expect before the Lord comes again from all the nations, that we also need to recognize that the New Testament model of church is often more like a network of small, dynamically multiplying churches, perhaps a bit like we might see in China because of its need to go underground. And I wonder, from what you've seen, what you make of that voice and whether you think there's something in it or not. And, you know, I guess it's also related to the call to recognize that perhaps the way we've structured ourselves in traditional denominations has been maybe more influenced by a worldly power structure than by the biblical model of leadership. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on
that. The question, Paul, of church models, I guess I remember some time ago, someone was saying we need to have a church like Acts, or New Testament church. And they said, well, would you like Philippi or Corinth? Which would you prefer? What's your model? I think the church very much is modeled by its culture, and I don't think that's wrong. I don't think there's a sacred biblical model for the church. I think that the church, like the church is indigenous, as Jesus, incarnational. Jesus is incarnational. I tried to make the point that the Bible is incarnational in that it comes into the people, as Peterson said in John 1, and he came and lived in the neighborhood. I think that the church will follow a model that relates to the culture. And so whether it's a mega or a small one, I'm not sure that one is more biblical or sacred than the other. I do think that regardless of what cultural models are used, I do find that generally that the small group is the most continuous model of nurture and discipleship that I've been able to see that crosses all boundaries. If you have a mega church, often the mega church is strong because you've got all of these small groups at play. So the kind of church that you have in Germany, I'm sure is different than the one that or might be the same as what David has in Norway. But I think it's fair. I think it's legitimate for us to look at the place that we are living in, its cultural mores, and find church patterns that fits the social construct of that community.
Very well said, Brian. Thank you for that. I think we have time for one last question before we go to our breakout rooms. And so I'm going to throw it to Jay Devers, who lives in California, but Jay helps lead the Dynamic Church Planting International Ministry that partners with MICN as we want to be more intentional planting churches. And Jay's got a question for you, Brian, about how church planting plays into this. So Jay?
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, Brian. Yeah, very, very great discussion. I wonder if you want to speak into the really the amazing role and the model of church planting movements that's going on today, and really the outlook for the near future. I think a bulk of those would be house church planting models. But would you like to address that? It's just so exciting to see this growth that's happening. That's so exciting in our day and age.
Yes, it is, Jay. And when you have globalization, you know that with every movement, there's a counter movement. And so globalization, which often takes into account the powerful mobilizers of whatever it is. And in this case, we have tended to be mobilized by the enterprises of the global north. But with that globalization, you have tribalization, and with the tribalization, it simply is people. While we are greatly influenced by the mega trends, the Facebooks, those kinds of things that provide in the social media, these canopies, these global canopies in which people participate. Yet at the same time, the need for tribal, for intimacy, for fellowship, for recognition, for support is, I think, even made more acute as globalization continues in its way. So it's there that the church movement, the church planting movement, I think finds its power. It's inspired by the Spirit, but I think it's the most brilliant methodology that one could ever think of. I mean, it's we've had it for many years, but of course, in your movement, Jay, you're finding ways of doing it even better. And so when you look at whether it's Nepal or India or China, Africa, regardless of what the big group might be, the small group, that church, that local church within often a home, can provide both the mobilizing and the training of people and discipling of people in ways that nothing else can do. So this, as a methodology, is certainly the at the forefront of the whole witness of Christ and the evangelistic outreach like we've never known before.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for that, Brian.
Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to go ahead and go into our small groups in just a moment. But before we go, our next two sessions with Brian Stiller are on May 18th and June 8th. Now, that's a Tuesday. Both of those are Tuesdays, not Wednesdays. And Brian has some exciting talks lined up. Brian, can you just tell us a little bit about what to expect when we come back together on May 18th?
Well, you know, as Jacob and I talked back in Hanoi about this event, and then, of course, we were planning on it last last spring in Thailand. I was so disappointed because Thailand's one of my favorite places to go. As someone said, anywhere for Jesus if the location is right. Um, and then this year, so I was thinking about what can I do to help you, because I love what you're doing. I know the price that many of you pay and your families, and I just praise God for you. And so we thought, well, maybe this thing that I just did today would be a way to begin. But as I'm thinking about you and your world and the kind of things that have mattered to me, I'm an old guy. I'm a few months away from being 80. And so I look at you and I aspire for you and I love what you're doing. And I wonder, what can I bring to you that I have learned that's been helpful? And so I have found out of the early part of Acts with Ananias and then Peter and Cornelius, some insights that have really helped me in the building of a ministry vision. So we're going to do that over the next two sessions, David.
Thanks, Brian. I really look forward to that. I think it's going to be really exciting and very applicable for us. Well, with that, Michelle, if you'll go ahead and send us into our small groups, we'll have a chance to chat a little bit about how this applies in our context and pray for each other before we go today. And I really hope to see all of you back on May 18th.